Today we're going to talk about the 4th Gen Cummins. That's the 2010 to 2018 2500 or 3500 Ram truck. These are great trucks, they make an awesome noise, they're prime for aftermarket modifications. We have quite a few coming through the shop and a few of our employees have owned them before. However, there are some things you have to look out for. We're going to go through their common failure points and how to check for them, solutions and upgrades to fix them so that when you're looking at a truck, if it has one of these problems, you can budget to repair it and also budget the price down. And then we're also going to talk at the end of the video about the killer dowel pin equivalent issue that the 4th Gen 6.7 Cummins have that you may want to be worried about because it can cause catastrophic damage. That's going to be at the end of the video. For now, we're going to talk about transmissions. Of course, when you make a Dodge video, you can't not touch on transmissions. It's a contentious subject, but unfortunately it's quite true. That's the most common failure point we see on these trucks, and it's really going to change what type of trucks you're looking at, because you have the G56 manual transmission, the 68 RFE, which is a 6-speed automatic, and then you have the heavy-duty Aisin automatic transmission, which is for the higher tow capacity or the high output engines. So it kind of changes what kind of trucks you're looking at, because when you have a Ford or a Duramax, a Power Stroke or a Duramax, you have one engine and transmission. So when you're looking at trucks, if you want a black crew cab long box, you look for black crew cab long boxes with the options and the mileage and the price that you would like. When you have a Dodge, you want a black crew cab long box, you're going to look at the price and mileage as well as if it's a G56, an Aisin, or a 68. So it reduces the number of trucks you get to look at, which is why it's really important beforehand to pick the transmission, the future modification plans, and what you want to use the truck for beforehand so you know what to look out for when you're buying. So the first of the 3 transmissions we're going to talk about is the Aisin. The Aisin is a 6-speed automatic heavy-duty transmission that goes behind the high-output versions of the 6.7 Cummins. And when this first came out, everyone was really excited that Dodge was finally putting a transmission behind their engines that could hold up to the power and the torque of the Cummins. And on a stock truck, that is entirely true. We've seen these things last hundreds of thousands of miles, hundreds of thousands of kilometers, towing regularly so long as you do proper fluid filter changes and fluid filter flushes. We've seen them be completely reliable units, and we quite enjoy them for a stock truck. The shortcoming of the Aisin is you cannot tune it, so you can't increase line pressure, you cannot make it shift faster, and the way that the Aisin saves itself for reliability is it defuels a lot between shifting, which is why you generally see the 68s actually have faster 0 to 60 times than these Aisins. 0 to 60 times kind of irrelevant in a stock truck, but it is something to consider. The Aisin shifts slowly. That comes into a problem when you are modifying the engine for power. Once you add a big power tune, we really don't see them having any longer lifespans than the 68s. They're pretty fragile when you add horsepower. On top of that, if you add a bigger turbo and you want to change your shift points or your lockups to make sure that your turbo is more often spooled and is in its power band, you can't modify an Aisin. So there's a couple of shortcomings to it. If you do already own an Aisin or you just desperately want to make sure that you have one, that is not a problem. We do offer stage 1 and stage 2 Aisin transmissions, which are stout. They hold up to a lot of power. While you can't change their shifting points, they still work really well for big power applications. It's not the end of the road, but if you are looking for a completely modifiable or customizable transmission, the G56 manual or the 68 RFE may be a better choice if you're going for a powerhouse of a truck rather than a stock tow truck. So if you are looking at an Aisin, just make sure that it shifts through all the gears correctly, there's no transmission shift codes, and that the fluids is nice, pink, smooth, they have a record of the service record of it being done, and it smells not burnt. If you don't have any records of it done, but it looks really good, we recommend just doing a fluid filter flush and filter, a fluid filter change and flush right when you buy the truck. And that's where the 68 comes in. Often discredited for being a weak transmission, in honesty, it is. We see them have quite a few problems. The moment you add some tunes to them, they constantly have failure rates. There's lots of people rebuilding them because there's lots of people who have practice. That being said, there's a saving grace. If you are looking for a stock truck, it's kind of a roll of the dice. You can probably get away with the 68, so long as you do some preventative maintenance we'll mention later. If you want to modify it, the 68 is actually also the way to go because it's the only transmission that's easily modifiable to hold quite a bit more power, and that's why with quite a few of our employees, actually one of our employees right now has a 5th gen Dodge with a 68 in it. It's because you can modify them after. Stage 1. This is what we would do with the 68, whether or not we were modifying it or keeping it stock. A high capacity oil pan on the 68 increases the fluid capacity, which increases your cooling. This pan as well also has cooling fins on the bottom, once again increasing your cooling. Keeping the transmission fluid cool is the greatest thing that will help extend the life of the transmission. Heat kills them, so having more fluid capacity having a high quality filter and fluid change is going to be paramount for the lifespan of your 68. This we would do modified or stock, as well as the thermostat bypass kit, which basically deletes the thermostat on the side of the transmission. What it does is it stops fluid from going to the cooler in the front of the truck when the transmission is cold. The problem is sometimes they stick. When they stick, no fluid ever goes to the cooler, so once you start driving, you're putting some load on it, all that hot transmission fluid is never going to the transmission cooler and you cook your transmission. Deleting the thermostat and just having it as a full system all the time ensures you'll never have that failure. Alongside of this, you could do a tune. A tune would increase your line pressure to about 180 psi. Increased line pressure will hold your clutches together better or reduce the risk of slipping. This, coupled with a tune, is a really great step to extend the life of your 68. Option number 2 is adding this. This is a Babymaker 2000 valve body. One of the problems with the valve bodies in the stock 68s is that they kind of cross bleed. The pressure will bleed into other systems and therefore not really give you any greater holding pressure on the clutches. Having a higher quality valve body is a great upgrade if you know you're going to modify the truck down the road and you're probably going to cook whatever stock transmission's in there. You install this in the stock transmission, you crank the line pressure up, you'll get a lot more lifespan out of the transmission and it'll hold a lot more power. And for when you eventually cook it, if you cook it, then you can move this valve body into your next build, because you can take the transmission with its deep pan and valve body to a rebuild shop, get a high performance set of clutches put in there, throw it all together and have yourself a solid 68 down the road. These have to be paired with a tune, but they are great options to put into your transmission if you don't want to do a full rebuild yet. The next option is just ignore all of these and go straight to a rebuilt transmission. We sell Randy's stage 1, 2, 3, and 4 transmissions that rate everywhere from stock power up to 1,000 horsepower. That's the biggest way you can go if you know you're going to build the truck up and you just want to drop the cash up front. Rebuilding or buying a replacement transmission and throwing it in the truck and forgetting about it is probably your surefire way to go. These are the stages of which you can get there if you want to build it over time. When you are trying to drive a 68 RFE, there are a couple of checks you want to do. Make sure it doesn't flare shift from the 3-4 and the 4-5 shift, which is basically when the RPM climbs between gear changes. So if you're going from 3 to 4, and let's say it was at 2000 RPM, and it should go to 1500 RPM when it shifts into 4th gear, but instead it goes from 2000 to 2300 RPM and then down to 1500. That's a flare shift. Make sure it doesn't do that excessively. We have seen a couple of units that'll last 100,000 kilometers doing mild flare shifting, but it's not recommended. So if you do see that, it's likely that it needs some attention. Make sure that the fluid is pink, doesn't smell burned, and make sure that there is no incorrect gear ratio codes when you roll into it and you drive it for a little bit. An incorrect gear ratio code means that one of the clutches has slipped. Surefire sign that the transmission will need to be rebuilt. Once they slip, they continue to do so and they get worse. So a slipping transmission or an incorrect gear ratio code is almost a surefire sign. You will need to rebuild that transmission and budget that into the truck that you're looking for, or you'll need to just walk away from that truck and find another one. Of course, if the two 6-speed automatics are not your choice, then you can go with the 6-speed manual. The G56 transmission is a Mercedes-derived transmission from when they were partnership with Mercedes and it was Daimler Chrysler. This transmission is a stout unit. We've seen quite a bit of power put through it. It shifts nicely. When you go to test drive it, just make sure the clutch engages smoothly. Make sure that it goes through all the gears, make sure there's no chattering or any noise. If there is noise, it could be a dual disc clutch. If they've upgraded to a dual disc clutch, there is sometimes chattering noises from the clutch. It's hard to decipher between a transmission issue and a dual disc making some noise, but if it's shifting smoothly and operating fine, it's quite likely just a dual disc. The clutch on the G56 from factory is almost slipping from a stock power level. You throw a Prius repellent tune on there and you'll make all kinds of smoke from all of the wrong places under this thing. That's why you want to upgrade the clutch, especially if you're doing any power mods or even if you're just going to have any big trailers behind that thing. What we really recommend is these Volair clutches, especially these quiet ones. They're twin disc clutches. You can get them rated from 600 horsepower and up, and they're really nice units because they don't make that normal chattering noise that most twin discs do. And then you get a huge power rating that you can really grow into modifying your engine without ever having to worry about the transmission again. Yes, we've seen monkeys driving these transmissions, breaking them at stock power levels. If you're smart with the transmission, we've seen them hold 600, 700, 800 horsepower without any problems. Push it much past that, you'll probably have to get some custom parts in the transmission as well. But that being said, at that power level, you're getting custom almost anything. A simple twin disc on a G56, you have tons of room to grow into that truck. Turbochargers! The turbochargers in these trucks are known to be problematic. And what can happen is the VGT system, the variable geometry turbocharger system, can stick, and that can either give you the characteristics of a big turbo, so you don't have any throttle response and you only have top end power, or more problematic, you can have the characteristics of a small turbo. What happens is the vanes in the VGT turbo, which open up when it's going to when you're in higher RPMs to create higher power and higher boost levels to give you top end power, and then they can close up to give you low end power. What happens is they'll get stuck in one of those two positions, and when they're stuck in a low end power, it'll act like your exhaust brake is on, because that's exactly what your exhaust brake is. And when it acts like your exhaust brake is on, that's creating an immense amount of back pressure into your engine, which can cause your head gasket to go. We almost never see 4th gen Cummins head gaskets go without a turbocharger problem alongside. So that's what you have to worry about, is if you drive one of these trucks that you're looking at and the previous owner says, yeah, it feels like the exhaust brake has been on for a couple months, but I just kind of ignored it. Run away from that truck or budget a head gasket issue and get that out of the price, because it's very likely it's had way too much back pressure. And when it's sticking as though it's open, that's not as big of a problem, because it just means you'll have less throttle response and you can get the turbocharger itself replaced. There are quite a few replacement units you can get. You can either get yourself a stock VGT replacement turbocharger, or you can get an upgraded VGT replacement turbocharger. Even on those like stage 1 turbochargers, we'll see 550 to 600 rear wheel horsepower on these things. So you can really get a truck that almost drives identical to stock and get some really big power upgrades, which means that after that you can still do injectors and you can do bigger fuel pumps and not have to worry about your turbocharger getting upgraded again. Or alternatively, you can upgrade to a turbocharger like this. This is actually a turbocharger off of a triple compound turbocharged power stroke, but it's the same concept. It's a non-VGT turbo. This will never plug up with soot again. This will no longer have any of the issues that the VGT turbos are known for. But the problem is if you have one of these, you will lose either top end power if you size it small for throttle response, or you'll lose throttle response if you size it large for top end power. You have to pick with these, more so than you do with the VGTs. The other option with VGT turbos is you could have your emissions parts just kind of fall off to the side there and then get a nice tune, and that would cause your problems to go away because the VGT turbo would no longer be eating the soot that comes back in through the EGR. And if I use my best girl math, buying a truck with a broken turbocharger already means that you've just discounted the performance turbocharger you were going to buy anyways. So it's basically free and you're saving yourself money. What you want to check for when driving a truck to make sure that the turbocharger is working is make sure it spools away from a stoplight progressively, so it has quick spool when you get off from the light and has top end power. You also want to engage and disengage the exhaust brake to make sure that it does both. If it does one and not the other, it's probably stuck. And make sure that it has no excessive smoke. And that's really how you check to make sure the turbocharger is okay. You can get away with quite a few miles on one of these turbochargers. It's just the risk that it might get sticky. After turbochargers, there's not too many things to worry about. Sometimes we hear about TIPM issues, T-I-P-M, which are basically the body control modules. If you find that when you hit the left window switch that your right front signal turns on, or your dashboard's all dark, or you hit the sunroof button and your brake lights come on, that's probably your TIPM. And it's not a terribly difficult job to replace, and you do want to have it diagnosed by a technician, but make sure all the electronics in the truck work. It's mostly an early 4th gen problem, but just make sure all the electronics work and you should be fine. The rest of the truck is just a used truck that you want to check for normally. It's got a solid front axle and a solid rear axle. Check for bushings, check for shocks, check for regular service history, check for uneven wear on the tires. Just check it out like a normal used vehicle. The previous things were all Cummins specific. The rest of it's just a live axle 3/4 or 1-ton truck. And finally, we have saved the last for last. What we have here is a grid heater delete, and this is a common product used on the Dodges because they have their equivalent of the killer dowel pin issues that the 12 valves had. Except in most cases, this failure is actually worse. The grid heater bolt that fails on the 6.7 liter Cummins grid heater will fall into your intake manifold and skitter down to your number 6 cylinder. It'll get past the intake valve and then ping pong around your piston, your cylinder wall, your cylinder head, completely fucking your block and making you need an entire new engine. It's a really unfortunate design that Dodge still hasn't fixed. If you buy a replacement intake manifold, or if you buy a replacement grid heater today, it's the same design as the one from 2007. It's insane that they still have it, and that failure of that bolt will ping pong around the engine and will destroy it, leaving you with a huge bill. So what you can do is you can delete it like this. This is basically called a high flow intake manifold, or high flow intake for the Cummins. This pairs really well with their Ram intake horn that has a helicoil style air heater that works like a grid heater to start your engine in the cold. So that's one option. You can pair that with Banks intake horn, or you can pair that with the BD intake horn. The other option is people just delete it. What they'll do is they'll take it off, put this plate on there, which gets rid of the grid heater altogether, but keep their factory intake horn. That's actually fine. We've still seen trucks in northern climates work okay. I think if you got to really cold temperatures, it would be too much to start without a grid heater, but it just slows it down a little bit, but generally it'll fire up. In a southern climate, yeah, you probably really are fine without using the grid heater at all. So one option is to delete it, but if you live in a northern climate, it's probably not the best. If you live in a southern climate, you can get rid of it altogether and not have to worry about the grid heater ever again. Unfortunately, replacing it with a factory Dodge one, you're gonna end up with the same problem. But there are a couple ways to know if it's failing. First off, any grid heater codes, check it. Check to make sure that the top of the bolt isn't loose, and that's the other way to check. Go under the engine bay, find that bolt and try to wiggle it. If it moves at all, don't drive that truck. Have it towed to a shop or put that new piece on there that gets rid of that grid heater. That's a loose bolt, it's on the verge of failing. What happens is the connector on it will melt, and that'll cause it to have a code thrown, which means it's not always the end of the world if it's got a code and it still isn't ping-ponging a piece around itself. If the bolt moves and you have any kind of grid heater codes, look into it, don't drive it. Make sure you get that covered, because the results of not doing so can be so detrimental to your wallet that you will hate the truck for life. So that's definitely why I saved this for the end, because it's probably the most important thing that I wanted to give its own category. It's a small, unassuming piece. Make sure you're on top of it. But that's why we saved this for the end, because it's probably the most important piece. I wanted to give it its own dedicated piece of the video. Check the bolt, make sure it doesn't move, and stay on top of that small innocuous piece and figure out your safety to make sure it doesn't happen to you. We hope this was helpful if you are looking at buying a 4th gen. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment down below. We are always happy to talk about these Dodges. We think they're really cool.